Hey, I got asked to share from an evangelical perspective what an evangelical is. And you could just simply say an evangelical is somebody who believes in the gospel and the Bible, but then you probably would only understand that if you were an evangelical. So what I want to do is give a little bit of a layout of how we got a movement called evangelicalism, how it's different from other strains in the visible church, and what that means. Okay? So try to hang with me here, because part of this is historical. If you don't understand the history of this, it's very difficult to make sense of the differences between churches in America. Okay? So if you go back to the 1500s to the 1700s, there were a number of movements that emerged in Europe that were significant. Because before this, Europe was basically fighting for its life. It was being invaded by Muslim armies during the era of the Crusades, and it didn't have very good farming practices, so there wasn't a very big thinking class of people who could sit around and think for a living. When those things got resolved, there was a growing number of people who thought for a living, who weren't just monks. And you got these four major movements: the Renaissance, it's called the rebirth of knowledge; the Reformation, a huge rebirth and transformation, reformation in religion; the Age of Reason, which is a growth in the idea of the use of reason, but also the scientific revolution happens during this time. And it culminated in what we often call the Enlightenment. Now, most people recognize that the Enlightenment is really a way to just congratulate yourself that you're smart, in reference to what they used to call the Middle Ages. People used to call the Middle Ages the Dark Ages, and then you had the Enlightenment, the bursting forth of light. But the movement of the Enlightenment can be encapsulated in something by a German philosopher, Immanuel Kant, where he said, the Enlightenment is encapsulated in the idea of daring to know. That is, in one of his essays called What is Enlightenment? He said, basically what he said is that the world at one point was the kind of world where we were kind of like intellectual children, and we needed the parenting of things like religion and traditions and things like that. But we're coming into this time now after these movements where we can really think for ourselves, where if we marshal reason and science and all the stuff that we've learned and we've known, we can create the future that we want if we will dare to think for ourselves. It was a more man-centered, more reason-based, scientific. That was the intention. Now, what these movements did essentially was totally change the way people thought about how they lived in the world. Now, if you move forward, one of the things to recognize is that everybody has what you might call a worldview or a world life view, that is, a way you see the world. And if you have a fairly complete view of what the world is like, your worldview will answer at least these four questions. The question of origin, where did I come from? The question of destiny, where am I going? The question of meaning, what does my life mean? What am I here for? And the question of morality, how should I live while I'm here? What does a good life look like, right? Now, in the 1840s to 1880s, of course, there's tons of people writing, but there were four people whose writings, and this is probably misspelled, that really changed the way people thought about answering these questions. When Charles Darwin wrote Origin of Species and his other writings, as those became more understood and more available and more accepted, people understood that there was a different way to understand origins than that just God created us. There was another way to think about it. Maybe we came about through descent with modification, through biological evolution. Marx gave a different picture of the future, a future of a classless society in which everybody owned similar things, and we wouldn't be of these different classes fighting against each other and trying to dominate each other. Freud brought about this idea of the inner mind and the inner person, and if you understood what psychology would teach, then you could completely understand differently what you are as a human being, what you're here for, what you're capable of. And Nietzsche basically made the argument that if all this other stuff is true, the way we've traditionally looked at morality is totally different. Now, as this was happening, as you approach the 20th century, particularly in Europe, there was the development of something called higher criticism, which was a way of academically writing and thinking about the Bible that tended to say, we're sitting in position to criticize the Bible, rather than before that people using the Bible to criticize us. Like you would go to the Bible and the Bible would say things about us, and we'd go, oh yeah, I'm a sinner, or I should live this way, or God is this way. And so the Bible sat in criticism of humanity, and we would respond to it with faith. Higher criticism reversed that role and said, no, we're human beings, and we're scientific people. The Bible is something we can study, we'll study it. And that tends to demystify and make the Bible something we judge rather than it judges us. It's a very different perspective. And also during that time, there were a couple of books written, the most popular by Draper and White. Draper's book was called The History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, which basically made this argument, and this argument started at least as far back as the 1880s with Huxley, that there was this intractable conflict between science and faith. that either you were going to be a modern scientific person or you were going to be an ancient backwoods religious believer. And you had to make a choice between the two because they were in conflict with each other. And the stories that were told were stories about Columbus and Galileo and people like that, and how religion fought against science, but science was able to grow up and be strong and to fight through the ignorance of religious people. Now, most historians of science now recognize that that's totally false. Most of the stories that you may have heard about the church persecuting Galileo for his scientific thought and all that sort of thing is totally wrong, but a lot of people still believe those myths because myths oftentimes have better sticking power than fact. Now, what this created was, at the turn of the 20th century, a very, very tense and conflicted understanding of what it meant to be a Christian in the modern world. And it ignited what is called by church historians the fundamentalist modernist controversy. I read the Wikipedia article on this. It's actually pretty good if you want some more information about this. But essentially what it meant was there was a conflict between people who believed that there were certain fundamentals about Christianity that had to be believed, and modern knowledge and those things had to be integrated to be faithfully Christian, and other people who believed that there was an ancientness to Christian faith that we needed to empty out, and we needed to refill the categories of Christian faith with modern learning. People who thought we needed to empty things out and refill with modern learning were referred to as liberals or modernists. And people who believed that there were ancient truths that we needed to hold and integrate modern learning with were referred to as fundamentalists, people who believed in the fundamentals. A few of the events that became really well known is, one, the publishing of a number of books called The Fundamentals. Now remember, at this point, there's no difference between fundamentalists and evangelicals. It's the same group. And they published 5 books full of articles by scholars designed to be given to pastors, Sunday school superintendents, people like that, to help explain why the new liberalism or fundamentalism wasn't a good idea. In response to this, a very well-known pastor who preached on the radio, whose sermons were published in newspapers, you gotta understand, back in the 1920s through the 1940s, you'd open the New York Times and there would be full printed sermons by pastors in the New York Times. It was a very different world in relationship to the church and the culture. Harry Emerson Fosdick was one of the best-known American preachers in New York City, and he preached a sermon called "Shall the Fundamentalists Win?" And one of the Rockefellers published it as widely as the Fundamentals, and it sort of ignited the other side of this controversy. And you go online and you can read that sermon today. Now, in 1922, the same time, was published one of the most famous books in the fundamentalist modernist controversy by a guy named J. Gresham Machen, who is probably one of the smartest fundamentals of this first generation. And essentially what he argued in Christianity and liberalism was that modernism or liberalism was a different religion than Christianity. That the two were not different ways of understanding Christianity, but the liberalism was a fundamentally different religion. That it didn't believe in the same God, it didn't believe in the same mechanisms of salvation, it didn't believe in the same destiny, it didn't believe in the same meaning, it didn't believe in the same moralities. They were fundamentally different. And what Gresham argues, Machen argues in this book, is that what liberalism does is it takes the words of Christian faith, salvation, atonement, Savior, God, and takes out their historical meaning and puts in a new modernist meaning in such a way as that they say the same words, he argued, but they mean something totally different. And the result is a completely different religion. This divide in the fundamentalist modernist controversy produced 2 extremely different movements that have diverged over time. And one of the ways this culminated in terms of our social history, you may have heard of, in 1925, was the Scopes trial. Now, it was called the Scopes monkey trial, and it's understood today as this sort of clash between fundamentalist religion and real science. But that's not what it was in 1925. Williams Jennings Bryan, the guy who defended was on the anti-evolution side. One of the things he was concerned about, he had been in the State Department during World War I, and they had got reports in World War I of German officers discussing social Darwinism. That is, that what Darwinism meant was the strong should simply overpower the weak. And there was a movement of eugenics, killing off weak, old, or disabled people, and that, in the minds of a lot of scholars, was associated with believing in evolution. And so for a lot of people in America, the question of evolution wasn't about descent with modification in terms of where we came from. It was about eugenics and social Darwinism and ultimately racism. And that's why Bryan, as a Democrat, was very much against teaching evolution the way it was in the book that was actually used in the Scopes trial. You see, for the other side, for the modernists and the liberals, it had everything to do with science, whether or not we were going to be scientific people. It ended up being a very unhelpful controversy where people were talking past each other, and then it's taken on a mythology of its own. Most people actually have no idea what really happened in the Scopes trial. But it became this historical marker of this controversy. Now, what happened is things went along for a while in these two camps. Fundamentalism was fighting for the old faith, the historic truth, and trying to integrate it with what they felt was real science. And liberalism was trying to keep up with what was happening in the world. The idea of liberalism is generosity and quickness to change. We just have to change stuff, and we can always change it back, but we need to keep up with reality and what we're finding out in science and so on. And that's what liberals were trying to do. Now, what happened over a couple of decades was, as fundamentalists were fighting against modernity, they left the institutions of society, the old seminaries, the public universities, and they started their own Bible colleges and so on. They developed a doctrine of separation. And they also, because liberals believed salvation related to social change rather than salvation spiritually in heaven mostly, because of that, they tend to focus on what was called the social gospel, or the political development of a better society. That's what they saw salvation as being strongly related to. Well, the fundamentalists reacted against this. They said, no, that's not what salvation is. Salvation is being forgiven of your sins in Jesus Christ and going to heaven ultimately when you die and being transformed in this present life in the community of the church and so on, right? But what that ended up meaning was fundamentalists began to draw back from the social implications of the gospel. And so in the late 1940s, there were two major events that split fundamentalism into two groups. One was in 1947, Carl F.H. Henry published a book called The Uneasy Conscience of American Fundamentalism, in which he argued that though the impulses of being true to historic Christianity were good, fundamentalism had done three unwarranted things that would ultimately lead to its demise. That is, A, it was anti-intellectual, and it wasn't integrating into modern society the way it needed to be relevant, that it was separationist beyond the biblical warrant, and three, that it was in moving away from the social gospel, it was losing its connection to the social implications of the gospel, and it was becoming socially irrelevant and unbiblical. Also, in 1949, what happened was Billy Graham launched his first Los Angeles Crusades, in which the fundamentalists said, if you're going to be a true Christian, you cannot have any Catholic or Presbyterian or United Methodist clergy on the stage. If you do, you're watering down the gospel and you're not a true Christian. But Billy Graham wanted to preach the gospel to everybody. And so he had a decision to make, and he decided to include all the churches. And in doing so, Billy Graham was launched as an evangelical star, and the 40 years or 50 or 60 years of Crusades followed that. But it made a very big split between fundamentalists and this new group that was first called the neo-evangelicals, the new evangelicals, but later became the evangelical movement. And so in the modern church world, you have expressions of liberalism or modernism still. In fact, most American churches probably fit in this category. You have evangelical churches who believe in the fundamentals of the faith, but with the modern caveats that came from Henry and Graham and others. And then you have the fundamentalist churches that essentially believe what they've believed for 100 years. And it's important to recognize that evangelicals consider themselves brothers and sisters with fundamentalists on the basic doctrines of the faith. But in some ways are closer to liberals in understanding how we are supposed to integrate with culture and understand who we are in a truly modern society. But evangelicals also agree that some of the doctrinal beliefs or doctrinal losses in liberal Christianity are really terribly bad and should be avoided, and that there are really good scientific and biblical answers for some of the objections of things liberalism has taken on by trying to stay with it, but actually has taken on much more than they need to and not actually integrated very well. Now, obviously, I've very much simplified something that's really complicated, but hopefully that gives you some sense of what evangelicalism is. And it'll also let you know is there's no such thing as an evangelical denomination or evangelical this or that. Every church and every person falls among these categories within denominations, across denominations, in independent churches, and all the way across the board. And churches change over time in relationship to these three categories. So it's a little slipperier than 5 points about a single movement. Hope this helps.
One of the easiest ways to describe this is evangelicals are gospel people and Bible people. We believe in the gospel, meaning that we actually believe that Jesus Christ was the Christ, that is the Messiah. He really was born of a virgin. He really taught us things that are true revelation from God. That is, they're 100% trustworthy. That his death was an atonement for our sins. That he died in our place to set us right with God. And that he really actually physically rose from the dead and will actually return. That is the good news, that we can be set right with God by simply trusting in what Christ has done for us, is the gospel or the good news. Now, the gospel ends up bigger than that, and its implications for society, life, personal feelings, all that kind of stuff are huge. But it is essentially that good news, that Christ, the God-man, died for you and for me to unite us with God. And the only condition of that union with God is faith. That's the gospel, the good news. But we're also Bible people too. That is, for the last several hundred years, people have just ruthlessly criticized the Bible and talked about how terrible it is and how untrustworthy it is and how you can't base your life on that thing. And evangelicals don't agree with that. We're not biblicists or literalists. We believe that it's the original manuscripts of the Bible that are inerrant, and therefore you have to engage in what's called lower criticism. We believe that you have to interpret the Bible by what the kind of writing each part of the Bible means. So, in that sense, we're not the kind of literalists or biblicists people accuse us of, but we take the Bible really seriously. We believe it's inspired by God and therefore completely trustworthy if we do the right job of interpreting what the Bible actually means and applying it to our lives, really. We make tons of theological mistakes, but we believe that the error is one that we are making, not one that the Bible's making. And we believe that the Bible is completely integrative to modern life. That if we really understood what the Bible was teaching, and we really understood scientific facts as they actually are, we believe that if we had perfect knowledge of both, and we had a brain big enough to put them together, they would completely integrate. And we believe they do integrate in the mind of God. And we don't believe we need to throw out the Bible to be modern people. We think in order to live well in the modern world, we have to be both scientific and theologically biblical people who believe the gospel. Hope that helps.